Welcome to the October 28th edition of the Tennessee World Affairs Council's Global News Review. I'm Patrick Ryan, and I'm joined by Ambassador Dick Bowers and Dr. Breck Walker. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Patrick.
Good to see you, Pat.
Good to see you all, and welcome back after our debate watch party. I know we had a lot of folks who got involved in that, and Ambassador Bowers, you were a bingo winner. You had enough to qualify for a prize, so congratulations on that.
Well, thank you very much.
I think it was a lively program. We thank David Plazas of the Tennessean and the Civility Tennessee project that he heads for moderating the pre and post debate panelists. We had a terrific panel, and that, among other things, is in our youtube.com/TNWAC archives, and we're going to talk more about that archive today. But let's get, we're going to cover the Earth today in our review of the Election 2020 series. But let's start with our quiz question. And as soon as we tee this up for Breck, we'll get underway. I think you've got that in front of you. Breck, if you want to start with that, go ahead.
You bet. Thanks, Pat. Well, as we have for the last 3 weeks, we've added a question to our What in the World quiz from the U.S. Institute of Peace report. And TNWAC's enjoyed a close relationship with the USIP, and we're very pleased to highlight these insightful, interesting reports on their website. So each week, question number 5 in the weekly quiz will be our USIP question of the week. And this week, the question is this. Kurdish authorities operate 24 detention facilities in northeast Syria, holding thousands of these former fighters. Authorities announced earlier this month they plan to release 24,000 from the Al-Hol camp because conditions there have become unsustainable. And so the possible answers are A, Al-Qaeda, B, ISIS, C, Al-Quds, or D, Al-Nusra. And we'll have the answer at the end of the program. Thanks, Pat. Terrific.
And we're going to take just a quick moment to talk about membership in the World Affairs Council. This is, we're wrapping up membership month, and I wanted to make sure that everybody had the opportunity to consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council. That's how we sustain our operations and the programs that we bring to you. You can see on your screen some of the basic benefits of membership. And if you go to tnwac.org/join, you'll see all these explained and the different membership levels. I'll mention 2 of the benefits. The Daily Chatter newsletter, which is a customized newsletter that comes to your inbox if you're a member every weekday. And there's the world famous Tennessee World Affairs Council coffee mug that'll be coming your way with the membership of the basic individual membership or higher. That's $60 level and higher. So we look forward to you considering becoming a member. And now we will jump into our program. Ambassador Bowers, if you want to just give us a brief explanation of what's on tap today, we will get right into it.
Okay, thanks. We're going to be discussing the topics presented in the Tennessee World Affairs Council's Election 2020 program. We hope that you were able to see some of these panels of distinguished speakers over the past several months. These are available, and you can catch up by going to youtube.com/TNWAC, have the video archives. So these particular projects were all outstanding programs. Pat, are you going to read them all, or just let everybody?
No, we'll let their eyes wander across that screen there, and then we're going to go into some of these and drill down a little bit, talk about these topics in particular, and I think I'll also mention, and you mentioned that these are available on the archives, and again, that's youtube.com/TNWAC, and you can see here an example of what the YouTube site looks like on the left, and we've got quite a collection of not just the Election 2020 broadcasts, but all the programs we do, including the world famous Global News Review with Ambassador Dick Bowers, Dr. Breck Walker, and myself. Those are all archived, as well as our programs with Mayor Carl Dean, Global Nashville with Carl Dean, and he talks to community leaders. So check out youtube.com/TNWAC for the videos, and those are available for you to review at your leisure.
And Pat, there's one thing on your list that won't be there because it hasn't taken place yet, and that's the America's Place in the World 2.
That's right.
So American Place in the World 1 has taken place, and you can watch the video, but 2 will be taking place on Thursday evening, or Thursday at 5:30, I believe, right?
Yep. Tomorrow at 5:30 will be the second part of America's Place in
Pickering
the
and
World.
Kornblum, 2 giants of the U.S. Foreign Service.
Right. Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Ambassador John Kornblum will be talking with our moderator, Professor Thomas Schwartz from Vanderbilt's Department of History. And I think that's going to be a really terrific program to get an understanding of and perspective on America's challenges in foreign policy and what's going on in the world as we look at either the second term of President Trump or a new administration of Vice President Biden. Let me finish with this slide, Dick. On the right-hand side of this, you can see our podcast page, and that's just the top of it. We, as we mentioned last week, we've gone over 100 podcasts, and 40 of them originally were strictly audio podcasts, but then all of our webinars since we started in March when the pandemic blew into town have been saved as both podcasts and webinars. So if you're a podcast person, check out soundcloud.com/TNWAC, or wherever you get your podcasts, just look for the Global Tennessee series of podcasts, and you can get all those for your listening pleasure. Dick, let's and Breck, let's jump into the first topic on that list that we talked about, and it was way back in August. We were privileged to have former Defense Secretary William Perry with us, along with Tom Kalina from the Plowshares, the director of production at Plowshares, which is probably the world's foremost nuclear nonproliferation organization, and Lisa Perry, and she heads a podcast connected with Secretary Perry and his participation in the book, The Button, which the full title is The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Trump to Truman. And I think you fellas were listening in on that, and the big takeaway of what they were talking about was the sole. Well, actually, a couple of things. They're both concerned about proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we talked about the New START treaty with the Russian Federation, which is due to expire in February. But the thrust of their book was the fact that we have one individual in the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, who's the sole nuclear release authority, and they like many Americans, are concerned that that power to without question release weapons from our country's nuclear arsenal is dangerous and needs to be reviewed and modified. Secretary Perry related a story when he was the defense secretary. He got a call at 3 o'clock in the morning from the North American Air Defense Command that a major attack of Russian ICBMs was underway, and he had minutes to get involved in the National Command Authority, relating that information to the president and possibly unleashing World War III. As it turns out, there was a malfunction in a chip in a computer that gave them that indication, and in fact, it was a false indication. So he talked about a couple of cases in history where the United States was moments away, and simply the decision of people at the top, whether we were at war or not. And that was back in the Cold War when people were more concerned. But still, the United States and the Russian Federation have over 1,000 strategic weapons pointed at one another. So this is a concern of the Nuclear Release Authority. They especially focused on the question of one individual, the President of the United States, having sole authority, and they proposed some measures to change that danger. They related the story of Richard Nixon during Watergate, when he was thought to be intoxicated during most of the final days, and Defense Secretary Schlesinger gave an order to the aides who were with Nixon that if he said, if he gave any direction about nuclear weapons release, that they should call him immediately. And that order was really illegal because the procedure is that if the president orders a launch, that's it. But he took the risk of intervening and prevented Nixon, if he had chosen to do something untoward like that, from doing so. So the conversation mostly focused on the release authority of the president, and the fact that we don't necessarily need to launch on warning, which is the process where if we detect a launch from, say, the Russian Federation or some other country with a ballistic missile, that we respond before the weapons hit. They argued that our nuclear deterrent was survivable enough, for example, the submarines, that we didn't need to have that. So I would suggest that people interested in this existential threat to the United States and the world take a listen to that program. Again, it's in our youtube.com/TNWAC archives, as are all of these programs.
Can I just jump in, Pat, with something that seems to be under the radar?
Yes, sir.
There's a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons where countries sign up and say, we will not make them and we won't have them on our soil. We won't have anything to do with them. And I understand that the 50 signatures have been reached and ratified, and that treaty is now going into effect. And the nuclear having powers, like the United States and China and Russia and the UK and France and Israel, we are all saying this is a bad idea. And this is something we're going to look at in the future, I think, because it's just kind of slid in under the radar of the U.S. elections there, but it's an important thing that's happened. Well,
there's a lot of things happening in the world of nuclear proliferation. We're going to talk about Iran and North Korea in the session today. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention too, just a little history, but back in the Reagan administration, the U.S. was engaging in a war preparation exercise, and I believe that they informed the Russians they were doing so. I think that exercise was called Able Archer. But in fact, as the exercise got underway, the Russians thought perhaps this was a ruse by the United States, and that an attack was really going to happen. And so they started going to higher levels of alert and began mustering some of their forces. And later on, when Reagan talked to Gorbachev, Reagan was, I guess, surprised that the Russians thought that we might take advantage of that situation and actually attack them first. And there's several historians that have written that incident had a big influence in Reagan turning hard towards an arms control orientation in his second term.
Yeah, there's the history of nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, arms control. It's really fascinating. And a lot of people it's in the background, sort of like pandemics were a year ago. And you never know when there's going to be the appearance of a threat that we minimize as not likely, but there's a whole category of unlikely but highly intense and damaging things that can happen in the world, and nuclear proliferation is in that category. Okay, well, let's move on, fellas, to the Middle East. We had two panels on the Middle East. The first was with David Rundell, an American diplomat. who was talking about his book on Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads, a fascinating book. And David is probably the diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service. He's retired now, but he was known to be the guy who had spent more time in Saudi Arabia than any other diplomat. He was there through many postings, and his book is being hailed as really an authoritative Bible on how to understand what's going on in Saudi Arabia. And then we had a separate panel on the overall Middle East with Rami Hori, a journalist from Beirut. He's also a scholar at the American University of Beirut, currently in Cambridge, spending time at Harvard, excuse me, as a visiting professor. Dr. Paul Pilar is a career CIA officer. He was involved in the national level activities as an intelligence officer. He was also head of the Counterterrorism Center. And we had Mona Yacoubian, who is an authority on the Middle East, especially Syria, with the U.S. Institute of Peace. So among these four individuals who have decades of experience in the Middle East, we really had a great oversight of what's going on in the region. And just we three can take a tour of the Middle East and talk about some of these things for just a couple of minutes. People don't necessarily consider Libya in the Middle East, but the State Department, the way it's organized, they call themselves the Bureau of Near East and African Affairs, MENA. So Libya, Egypt, that extension from the Arabian Peninsula has really seen a lot of interesting activity. There's still a civil war going on in Libya, and it's involved a number of external powers, including some of the European actors, Turkey, Russia. There are Syrian militias or soldiers who have been conscripted to go to Libya. The Egyptians are involved. The United Arab Emirates is involved. So it's really become an internationalized conflict. There continue to be efforts to bring a peace treaty about between the forces based in Benghazi in the east and the capital Tripoli in the west. And the UN has recognized the government in Tripoli as the authoritative government for the whole of the country, but there's still the fighting going on. Moving to the Eastern Mediterranean, though, in our global news review of the past couple of weeks, we've talked about a potential confrontation between Turkey, who is exploring the Eastern Mediterranean for gas and oil reserves, undersea oil reserves, excuse me, and the conflict that could arise between Turkey and Greece over those areas. Greece is involved in the splitting of Cyprus between North and South as a result of the 1974 war on Cyprus. The Turks control the northern part, and the Greek Cypriots control the south. So the area of the Eastern Mediterranean that's being explored by Turkey crosses some contentious lines that Greece claims. So we need to be on the lookout for potential for conflict between Greece and Turkey, two NATO allies in that area. The Levant, or the area of the Middle East bordering on the Eastern Mediterranean, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. Israel, as we've discussed, has normalized relations with Qatar, Bahrain, and most recently Sudan, another Arab nation. So there's been some progress in reducing tensions in the area, but the Palestinians haven't signed on to any of that. So we still have a stalemate between Israel and Palestine over the West Bank, Gaza, and so forth. Lebanon, we've discussed the political, economic situation there. They're in dire straits. The economy is really troubled. We know that they had an explosion in the port area about a month or so ago that damaged a considerable part of the port, killed and wounded many Lebanese, and damaged a lot of the downtown area. So Lebanon continues to struggle with their economy, their politics, demonstrations. There's a caretaker government in place, So we'll see what happens there. And Lebanon is really sort of in the crossroads between battles between Hezbollah and Israel, and the connection with Syria and Lebanon. Syria continues to be plagued with the remnants of the civil war, battles going on in the north, the potential for resurgence of ISIS, which formed its caliphate based in Syria, which had been beaten back, but those forces are still in the area. And you know, as Breck noted in the question of the week, 24,000 people from a detention facility in northern Syria are about to be released, and those are former fighters that could be re-entered into the battle there. Iraq is another troubled country. Divisions there persist. There's been trouble forming a government that could control what's happening throughout the country. A major problem is with the militias that were formed, and many of them backed by Iran. And they have been attacking and harassing U.S. forces that are still in Iraq, U.S. forces that were in Iraq to fight ISIS. The United States is looking at reducing that presence. So we will have to be mindful of what's happening in Iraq vis-a-vis U.S. relations. About a month ago, Secretary of State Pompeo threatened the Iraqi government that the United States Embassy in Baghdad would close if the Iraqi government didn't do more to quell the violence from the militias. Let's move on to the Persian Gulf, a never-ending source of interesting things going on, and you can see the map on the right shows Iran to the east in the Persian Gulf, and then going counterclockwise: Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, this small island here in the Gulf, Qatar, the thumb that sticks off the side of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Oman, part of which is in the Persian Gulf. And then the rest of it is down along the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. So what's going on in the Persian Gulf? Iran is at the receiving end of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign. They've mounted what's been called maximum resistance. They're not buckling to the demands that Secretary Pompeo announced after the U.S. withdrew from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is known as the Iran nuclear deal. That deal among the United States and the rest of the P5+1 powers, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union. That deal was to hold Iranian nuclear developments in check, to prevent them from acquiring fissile material with which to build a nuclear weapon. The US pulled out, and the other powers are trying to keep the deal in place. However, Iran last year announced that they were going to continue producing fissile material beyond the limits of the JCPOA, since the United States had pulled out of the deal. And in the news today, Breck and Dick, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a report that construction in Iran has begun on a new centrifuge production facility underground. So Iran is pushing the limits of the JCPOA, and basically telling the United States, if you don't want to be in it, we are going to not comply fully with the conditions of the agreement. So that's something to be watching, what happens with the nuclear portfolio vis-a-vis Iran. And you know, before we had the JCPOA, there were intermittent threats that the United States and possibly others would use military force to destroy some of these facilities. And you know, now we're in the uncomfortable position where we no longer have the nuclear deal, but we have to determine what the course is with Iran and its nuclear program. Saudi Arabia across the Gulf is aligned with the Gulf states in opposing Iranian expansion and activities throughout the region. Saudi Arabia is predominantly Sunni. Iran is predominantly Shia in the Muslim faith. So there's both religious differences as well as cultural differences. Saudis are Arabs, Iranians are Persians. And then there's the contention over expansion and exporting the revolution from Iran. So Saudi Arabia and Iran are at loggerheads over a number of issues. And on the side of Saudi Arabia are the GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council members, which includes Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE and Oman. There is a contentious issue that arose about 2 years ago between Qatar and especially Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. There's been an embargo and a cessation of normal political relations between Qatar and the others. So that's an issue. It's exacerbated for U.S. foreign policy, and it's an issue for us in that Qatar is the home of the Al Udeid Air Base, which is a major U.S. Air facility and the base for the U.S. Central Command, our staff that controls U.S. military operations in the region. So having a contentious relationship between Qatar and the others, when the United States is trying to get everyone, all of our Gulf partners, to play together is a difficult issue. Let's see, what else is going on in that part of the world? Dick, any of your observations on the Middle East that you'd like to share?
I'll just throw out one observation: how little in our internal campaigning between Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump is mentioned foreign policy. So, I mean, America is really focused on our naval, and it's not, I think, a good thing in the long run. We've got serious issues out there, and we need to be tending to our allies and our alliances, and I don't think we're doing a very good job of that.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting place, and let me pause at this point to remind our folks who are with us today. We would enjoy having your questions, and I would think that covering the whole world, Breck, that people would be able to come up with a question or two. So I challenge our audience, our attendees today, to put a question in the chat box, and we'll look forward to taking that on. You've got at least two folks here, Breck and Dick, who know the world like the back of their hands and would be happy to answer any questions. So please throw some questions in the chat box. And with that, we're going to turn to our friend Dr. Breck Walker to talk about a panel that he headed up on Russia, North Korea, and Afghanistan. Breck, over to you.
Thanks, Pat. I moderated a panel back on September 17th dealing with hotspots. Again, issues that we felt should be issues to consider when you're deciding who to vote for in the presidential election. And on that panel, we had 2 career Foreign Service officers and a well-known scholar from George Washington University that specializes in Russian-American relations. But before I get into some of the quick specifics of what they had to say, I wanted to comment, if I might, on the remarkable symmetry to their perspectives on the importance of good old-fashioned diplomacy for U.S. interests in the world going forward. And given his experience as a career Foreign Service officer and former ambassador, I was going to ask Ambassador Bowers, after I go through these 3 points, to comment on this and see whether he agrees with them or not. But in my mind, the first point of agreement among my panelists is this, that diplomacy is a vital activity, and that the U.S. as leader of the free world needs to be very, very good at it if we're to influence the world in ways that produce peace and prosperity for most. Now, the famous Chinese leader in the 60s and 70s, right-hand man to Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, once famously said, all diplomacy is a continuation of war by other means. And I think my panelists would strongly disagree with that. I think they'd say that conflict is usually the result of a failed diplomatic effort, and conflict is often unintended and the result of miscommunication or poor diplomacy. The second point of agreement that I think we had on my panel was that diplomacy is the long game. To diplomats, talk is not cheap. Talk is often the whole ball game. That engagement in and of itself should be a key foreign policy strategy, that communication between adversaries helps to keep the peace, even if all it is communication. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you might get an agreement out of it. And I found this quote from Mr. Talleyrand, who was an 18th century French foreign minister. And he said, quote, "A diplomat who says yes means maybe. A diplomat who says maybe means no. And a diplomat who says no, well, he's no diplomat." And I think my panel would agree with that diplomacy is a lot about keeping the conversation going. And that in and of itself is a very useful accomplishment, given what the alternatives might be. And then the third and final point coming out of my panel on this topic is this. Although it may sound a little partisan, there was agreement among my panelists, and that was presidents matter greatly when it comes to American foreign policy. And all three were critical of the Trump administration's approach, saying that it was uncoordinated, that it lacked an underlying strategy in most instances, that it was subject to sudden shifts based on the president's impulse in the moment, that it has tended to weaken our historical alliances and has tended to embolden autocratic leaders who do not share our values towards democracy and human rights. So just, Dick, if you don't, do you have any comments on that with your long experience in the State Department?
Dick, I'll let you think about that another second. I'll just comment that you've been ambushed by the PhD on the panel here with Talleyrand.
Yeah, the answer is I agree with all three of those points, and including Mr. Talleyrand. I used to use an expression that, you know, what is a diplomat? A diplomat is someone who never gives offense inadvertently. So that means you can tell the other guy is an SOB, but you have to be sure you really want to do that. You know, I view this whole thing with diplomacy as diplomacy is our first line of defense, and it's when the diplomats can't resolve the problems by discussion and sitting down together and trying to work out compromise. Then you have your military, which you turn to. But we have really not pushed ahead with the diplomats as the first line of defense under the Trump administration. There is no coherent foreign policy in the United States as far as I'm concerned right now.
Well, I wish you'd been on my panel, Dick. You would have had a lot of colleagues agreeing with you on that.
Well, there's a lot of people agree. And in fact, part of the problem is that so many foreign service officers have agreed that it's chaos with the Trump administration. Then a lot of them have bailed out, and the State Department is gutted out, and it's a hollow place these days. And part of the problem is the State Department is kind of like the military. If you want to have the Tom Pickerings and the John Kornblums down the road 30 years from now, you have to hire junior officers. You got to bring the lieutenants in so you can have generals, right? And we have not been doing that for the last 3 or 4 years, and we're in bad shape. So a new Biden administration, should the man win, I think one of the first things on his list of things to do is to reinvigorate diplomacy.
Hey, Breck, if I could just make a point, I think your panel exemplified this election 2020 series. We were blessed to bring in some talented people to talk about these issues. And you had Andy Sporsheimer, who had been the Deputy Chief of Mission in Kabul, Afghanistan, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State with the portfolio for Afghanistan. Ambassador Christopher Hill, another legendary diplomat, who was ambassador to several countries, including South Korea. And he was the undersecretary, Dick, is it undersecretary for East Asia or?
Assistant Secretary.
Assistant Secretary, excuse me, for the East Asia portfolio, and Dr. Svetlana Saravinskaya, a scholar on Russia. And this is typical of the quality of the panelists that we brought in. So I really recommend to people to take a look at some of these Election 2020 programs. You really will have some insights and perspectives on these issues that you couldn't get anywhere else. So we're extremely pleased to be able to bring those folks to you, and in perpetuity in our youtube.com/TNWAC archive. Anything you want to get into specific to Russia, North Korea, and Afghanistan, Breck?
I'm happy to, if you'd like, I'm happy to pass too, but I'm happy to reduce 90 minutes of good conversation down to 4 to 5 minutes of highlights if you'd like.
What was your major takeaway? And these are all challenges to the U.S. We're fighting a war in Afghanistan. We could be at war in North Korea in 10 minutes, and Russia is acting belligerently around the world, and the U.S. is, we've had face-offs with Russian troops in Syria. There's the threat in the Baltics and Ukraine. So these are adversarial relationships where troops are deployed, and we have U.S. interests clearly defined. What were your major takeaways?
Well, starting with Afghanistan, and extremely briefly, I thought that Ms. Forsheimer, who has been in Afghanistan, as Pat mentioned, is the #2 person in our embassy there for over 2 years. And we've talked about this in a prior global news report. I mean, America's the American public is getting very tired of the war. And under Presidents Obama and President Trump, we have withdrawn most of our troops. And we are with the Afghan government in negotiations with the Taliban right now to see if there can be some sort of agreement that would end hostilities and that would also reintegrate the Taliban into Afghan society while preserving the accomplishments that the Afghan people, with some help from us, have achieved over these last 20 years, almost 20 years. And I think Annie's major points were that there are serious accomplishments that are underappreciated in terms of prosperity and health and rights for women and a more open, free society than was the case when we first went in there. But the diplomatic task that we face at this point is formidable because the Taliban thinks that they're in a position to win, that in all likelihood the U.S. is going to bug out and they can reassert themselves. And the Afghan government itself is one that today is divided and by all accounts extremely corrupt. And if there is a diplomatic solution there that we would push, it's going to be a very long process. And she's very hopeful, I would say, maybe not optimistic, but hopeful that the American public will, and whatever administration comes into power after this election, will try and live up to the commitments we made to the Afghan people when we went into Afghanistan 20 years ago. And then I guess if it's okay, quickly moving on to North Korea and Christopher Hill. The points that Christopher Hill has been very involved in the negotiations through the years with North Korea over its nuclear capability. He was the lead negotiator in the six-party talks that started under the George W. Bush administration. I think he would make the following points, or I think he did make the following points, that Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, his reason for wanting nuclear weapons is to try and fracture the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. And once fractured, if the U.S. pulls its troops out, then Kim would look for opportunities to move militarily, in Christopher Hill's opinion, to reunify the peninsula under his rule. And Ambassador Hill points out that President Trump has mused on more than one occasion about removing U.S. troops in order to save some money and also in order to eliminate a source of tension on the peninsula. And Ambassador Hill thought that was playing right into to Kim's hands. Hill went on to say that he thought it was very important that the U.S. never give up on trying to find a diplomatic way to make North Korea give up, its nuclear ambitions, that's important for peace in the region, it's important for our influence in the region, and it's important for our alliances, especially those with South Korea and Japan. And the last point, he said, is the key to making progress in North Korea, in his mind, is China using its influence and leverage. The Chinese absolutely need to be a part of any future negotiations, he argued, and he lamented that under the Trump administration, the relationship with China has become worse. And I'm sure there's fault on both sides, but one result has been that China and North Korea have been drawing closer together, and that undoubtedly pushes any progress on the nuclear issue farther to the future. And then on Russia, Dr. Savinskaya, she's director of Russian programs at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. And very summarily, she said that Russian-American relations today are worse than they've been at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a dangerous situation that both countries are in the midst of major nuclear modernization programs. We're not talking to one another right now, and a miscommunication could lead to a dangerous situation in her mind. She says that she believes that mistakes have been made on both sides since the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 that have caused Russian-American relations to decline to the point that they are today. In Crimea and Ukraine on the Russian side, and on the US side, perhaps withdrawing from arms control treaties, expanding NATO to former Soviet republics. There's been, from each perspective, there's been provocations on both sides, and the result has been rising tension and much less communication back and forth. And her points relative to American diplomacy going forward were these: that Russia's a weak nation today. Unlike in the Cold War, Russia's a weak nation today economically and militarily, except for its nuclear weapons. And it's not at all the strategic threat that China is to US interests looking out 10 or 20 years. She argued that Russia really has no friends today, no real global alliances. This so-called realignment with China is very definitely going to be on Chinese terms, and it is not an alliance. It's not an alliance yet, but it's not a budding alliance of equals by any means. And that Russia is concerned about its national security. That's what's driving a lot of its foreign policy actions. And she would argue from Russia's perspective, maybe it should be, because over the last 20 years, NATO has pushed right up, or tried to push right up to the Russian border. And that makes Russia, its people, and its leadership nervous. And she did make a comment, because it's been in the news so much, Russian interference in US elections. And she would argue that there's a little bit of tit for tat in that the United States, from a Russian perspective, has in the past tried to interfere in Russian elections. And I can remember Hillary Clinton's comments as Secretary of State that really made Putin mad when he ran for office during that time period. Russia, like the USA, Russia under Putin, like the USA under Trump, has become much more nationalistic. And she does make the point, and I think this is an interesting one. She said in the Cold War, while tensions between the governments were high, nevertheless, the Russian people had a respect and an admiration for the American people. They wanted their society, in many instances, to be more like American society. And Svetlana said today that's not true, that there is rampant anti-Americanism, and that people in Russia view the United States increasingly as a sort of an American first bully that goes its own way. So what should the US do at this point to try and improve relations? Well, again, it's diplomacy, that if our objective long-term is to help shape, to encourage a civil society and more representative government in Russia over time, the first step in doing that is re-engaging in communication to, as the Obama administration said, to really make an effort at resetting relations. And the place to start is arms control. And the Trump administration has done that to some degree by reopening talks on START that Pat mentioned earlier. But she also recommended that we look for multilateral opportunities to work together as well, just to get the communication going. And Russia, for example, is very much behind the Paris Climate Treaty. They are interested in working multilaterally on pandemic issues, and they are interested in cobbling back together in a meaningful way the Iranian nuclear agreement. And Svetlana thought that if we have an administration that wants to pursue those actions, there's an opportunity to re-engage with Russia as well that we shouldn't pass up. And for those reasons, she thinks the Biden administration would do a much better job of reducing tensions and re-engaging Russia in a positive way than a second Trump administration would. So Pat, I'll leave it at that and see if you all have any comments.
Breck, I think we're going to move on, but that was a fantastic recounting of that panel and some really important issues on the table there facing the next, whoever's sitting in the seat in the Oval Office on January 21st. So thanks for that. We're going to jump into China now and talk a little bit about the panel. We won't do too much of a deep dive here because we've been talking about China almost every global news review, and I really strongly recommend that you take a look at this panel on our video in the YouTube library. Dr. Susan Haynes, Professor Haynes from Lipscomb University and a member of our board of directors, chaired that terrific panel, which included John Scannapieco, who's also on our board, but he's a leading attorney at Baker Donelson, and he has the portfolio of global business with Baker Donelson. Dr. Yang Zhang from the University of Tennessee, professor of political science, expert in U.S.-China relations. Bonnie Glazer, she's senior advisor for Asia and director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington. She was on the panel. And our friend of the World Affairs Council, Jeremy Goldkorn, editor-in-chief of subchina.com. It's a website. He's got decades of experience in China, and he shared that with us in the program. Just quickly, we'll talk about some of the high points of the relationship, and we're going to be spending more time on this in as global news reviews and other programs come about in the following weeks and months, because China really is the key relationship of the United States going forward in this decade and decades to come. It's just behind the United States in terms of economic power, and it is increasingly an expansionist military power as you look at the South China Sea, the expansion of military bases in islands that are under that are contested by numbers of countries. So those are areas where we have to watch Chinese military expansion, as well as the threat to Taiwan. China claims Taiwan. The United States recognizes it as a part of one China, but it is a separate government. The United States has relationships with it, and Xi Jinping is increasingly aggressive in rhetoric and military movements regarding Taiwan. So the United States policy towards Taiwan could face a test here in the not too distant future. We're going to quickly, in the interest of time, and I really want to be able to give Ambassador Bowers time to talk about America's place in the world, but I want to mention one of the panels, and this is another one that you should take a listen to. We had Professor Jeff Overby from Belmont University, Director of Center for International Business, and a member of our board. He was chair for a multi-issue panel that included climate, Mr. Gary Garfield, former CEO of Bridgestone North America, who's now an expert on climate issues. He gave a presentation that you should listen to. Professor Erica Owen, she talked about trade. She came to us from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, where she is a specialist in globalization and trade. And we also were pleased to have with us Dr. Richard Wyke, Director of Global Attitudes Research at the Pew Research Center. And he was in the news, in the headlines that week. Pew had just published a new survey they did abroad of international attitudes towards the United States. He briefed us on that with a lot of compelling charts and graphics. So take a look at this panel on video. You really will find some great material. Dick, I'm going to turn to you now. We have enough time for you to share your thoughts on America's place in the world. Again, we had a absolutely terrific panel. Dr. Tom Schwartz, professor of history at Vanderbilt, talked with General John Allen, a retired U.S. Marine Corps four-star, had commanded NATO forces in Afghanistan, along with many other really significant posts in the United States military, including the U.S. Central Command, responsible for the Middle East. And we also had with us Dr. Jessica Matthews, who retired after leading the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for almost 2 decades. The two of them really were a wealth of information and perspective on what's going on in the world. So Ambassador Byers, I'll hand it off to you to talk a little bit about that panel.
Well, was a terrific, terrific panel. And all these guys, General Allen is indeed a 4-star Marine retiree. I would give 4 stars to Dr. Schwartz and to Dr. Matthews as well, because they are brilliant people who have been laboring in this field for a long, long time. And Tom Schwartz was an excellent moderator. He tried hard to exploit differences of opinion, but there really were very few. The two panelists have got years and years of experience in foreign affairs. And basically, coming to a couple of the takeaways. First off, they were both kind of shocked that American foreign policy is nowhere to be seen in this election campaign, except for bashing China from time to time. The US role in the world, they say, has run out of steam. We used to be the leader of the free world. Dr. Walker referred to us as the leader of the free world. There's some doubt about that now, not because the world doesn't want us to lead, but because we have not decided to take up that mantle and lead. We lost the Soviet embassy in the Soviet enemy, I'm sorry, in the years past. And that has taken some of the steam out of the desire of the United States. The transition from Cold War to no more adversary to superpower unopposed was not handled all that effectively. China is a rising power, and they both tend to agree that probably the most single important bilateral relationship that the United States has is with China. Biden is going to have to create a new international strategy. They talked a fair amount about, can you just revise where we were? Can we pick up what we've dropped down and go back to the world as it was? Status quo ante, they both agree, was not an option. You're going to have to deal with the world the way it is, and the world has moved on. But relationships with other powers, particularly China and India, are vital, according to General Allen, and we have to stop bashing our allies, get back with good relationships with NATO. Trust is something that is very fragile, and he believes, General Allen, that we have violated the trust of our allies, and it's going to be a very difficult task to get back. So transatlantic relationships, NATO, EU are all under stress. There's technology issues coming down, artificial intelligence, Middle East challenges, global challenges. They both agreed that the #1 challenge facing the United States is climate change. And we've got to get a hold of that and get the rest of the world working with us. America used to lead, like they said. With Trump, we no longer lead. China, pandemic, climate, lots of ways to work together, but we also need to compete. So the trade wars, they both agreed we are losing. Sanctions just don't make it in the long run. And we need to rally our democratic allies and capitalist friends and stop apologize for alienating them in the last 4 years. So we have really not been a very good ally. They talked a bit about China and Taiwan, and Taiwan is a high threat. General Allen said it's really a very short slope to go from confrontation to conflict. And we have just in the last few days, the administration announced to Congress its intention to sell a major weapon system to Taiwan. The Chinese will react to that, I am certain. Alan said you can't have a China policy with a policy that encumbers all of Asia, including Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. We need to engage, but not make them choose between us and China. So it shouldn't be either or. It should be in their interest to engage with us and also to engage with China. There was a pivot to Iran that Tom Schwartz wanted to talk about. Both of the speakers, the general and the professor, thought that the JCPOA, the Iran deal, was a good deal, and that it was absolutely absurd for the United States to pull out of it. Tom asked them, do you think if the Biden administration takes over and Mr. Biden does win the election, would we get back into the JCPOA? And they thought that may not be as easy as just you think it might be. But obviously we need to do something on that front. Trust again came up. They kept talking about trust, and trust is a sine qua non for getting along in the world. And given our disparaging treatment and our slamming of our allies over the last 4 years, we've hurt ourselves, and it's going to take a long time for them to say, yeah, we can trust you again. On Russia, no quick reset. They basically are with you, Breck. Step one, they've said, should be that we work with the Russians on those areas where we have common interests, such as arms control. And that, I think, is going to happen. Neither of them.
We're going to run out of time here. So if you could wrap it up, we'll.
All right, I'll wrap it up. One quick question of why Trump seems to treat Putin as he does, and why he prefers, people who are strong men rather than democratic allies. End of the story is, if Trump wins the election, both parties think we're in for very dark times in the international arena, but very dark times domestically as well. If Biden wins, he's got a major job of fixing all the stuff that's been broken and reinvigorating our diplomacy and our ability to engage in the world. It's a fascinating discussion, and I would urge all of you out there to go to the YouTube site and spend an hour or so and watch it.
YouTube.com/TNWAC for all of these programs. Dick, we do have a question for you from an anonymous attendee. Can you comment on the election result in Bolivia?
I can't comment on it.
Well, I don't know if our audience.
Will I comment? Yes. Basically, two quick nutshells.
Let's let everybody know. Let's let everybody know that you are a former ambassador of Bolivia. So that's why I
ambassador to Bolivia.
To Bolivia, yes.
From the United States.
Yes.
I'm not a Bolivian ambassador.
Thank you.
Okay. Basically, when Evo Morales usurped his authority and power and tried to stay in power too long, people got upset. They were okay with him and his socialism, like building schools and roads and bridges and healthcare facilities and things of that sort, but they didn't want him usurping democracy. So basically he went away. The guys that replaced him were conservative, old school elites. And the people of Bolivia didn't want that back either. So they elected a man who is Arce, who is representative of the party of Morales, but is not a Morales stooge. Nutshell, that's it.
And I think we're due to talk about Bolivia coming up in a global news review, so maybe we can take that on. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. We're going to let Breck do a quick read through of our quiz questions, so everybody doesn't leave wondering what the answer was. Breck?
Well, I don't think that's the right quiz question, is it?
Yes, you are correct. Thank you.
But I can remember the quiz question. In any event, I'll go ahead, Pat, if it's okay. So the question was, what group are the Kurdish authorities having to release from detention because of inadequate facilities and lack of resources? And the answer is B, as I recall, ISIS.
Great. That is correct. And that's our question. And thank you everybody for being with us today. We enjoyed going through the Election 2020 programs. Again, we were fortunate in attracting a terrific lineup of speakers. All of these programs are at your beck and call at youtube.com/TNWAC. You can also find links to them on our website, tnwac.org. Again, please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council. That's how we continue operations here. And
you can get a coffee cup. Right?
A coffee mug. And we also will be having a members only briefing on January 12th with Professor Thomas Schwartz. He'll be talking about the Cold War, and that will be for TNWAC members only. Also, you don't have to pay the $10 to attend tomorrow evening's fantastic America's Place in the World with Ambassador Thomas Pickering and John Kornblum, and we will see you all there. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Great program, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much.
See you.
Good to see you.
Well, that was an interesting report by The Economist, and it summarizes what's going on in Xinjiang province. I would note a couple of things. One is the surveillance system in Xinjiang is probably the Chinese surveillance system on steroids, but it is not exclusive to Xinjiang province. It's ubiquitous in China, that surveillance, facial recognition, accumulating big data, knowing who's where, when. That's all going on. I had a friend who was flying into Beijing before the pandemic and walked up to a kiosk, and before they could enter their boarding pass or visa information or any data, the kiosk lit up with their full account. It knew who they were approaching the kiosk without any interaction between the individual and the kiosk. So that's just one example of how big data is being used to keep track of people, not just foreigners, but Chinese as well. There's a system in China called the social credit system. Dick, Breck, I don't know if you've heard of this, yep, where big data is used to track the behavior of individuals and corporations, et cetera, with the aim of building a trusted society in which people adhere to the rules, and it accumulates things. If you jaywalk, it will start to accumulate points. If you pay your taxes late, there's points that go into the system. And there are reports that people have been denied the ability to get on a plane or a train because they didn't have enough social credits in the system to allow them to be a trusted individual, and as punishment they were not permitted to do this or that thing. But getting back to the Uyghurs, we've got a serious issue here of how to address that, given the current climate between Washington and Beijing. The Chinese are not going to tolerate anybody interfering in their internal affairs. So the likelihood that the United States will be able to change behavior in this regard is, what would you guys say, about near zero?
Well, I don't. To change behavior is obviously the ultimate goal, but to stand up for liberal beliefs in the world and a system of democracy where individuals count is something, we need to lay down that marker. The Chinese basically, it seems to me and others, I think, stability and economic advancement are more important than an individual's freedom. And that's antithetical to what at least our forefathers and what this country has stood for since it started out. In the future, security, because people are insecure, they will gravitate to someone who promises them some security. But it's a real conflict between two different worldviews, individual freedom and liberty and the worth of a particular individual, or are you part of a collective, and as long as the leadership gives you security and economic advancement, you're expected to toe the line.
And I think the key word in the stability equation there is total control of the Communist Party.
Yes.
They are not going to tolerate any pushback to their authority anywhere in China, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, wherever.
Well, go ahead, Brent.
I was just going to say, it's interesting, though, that with all the mass migrations of meaningfully sized populations from other places throughout Western Europe and parts of Asia, it's interesting that issues are being raised that haven't been raised before in terms of that are from a government perspective, national security issues. And if there were a large separatist movement to develop in northwestern China, that would present some problems for the Chinese government. And even human rights advocates like, if I'm pronouncing this right, Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, she has come out for not as bad as the Chinese, but certainly has been in favor of. So it's just interesting, some of these issues that are raised now that are modern day issues that governments are, and again, I'm not in any way condoning the Chinese at all, but the governments are dealing with issues that are difficult ones right now.
Well, yeah, I think in the case of Aung San Suu Kyi, she was elected to the head of government there, even though the military is clearly behind what's going on in Myanmar. But she went to the UN and openly defended the government's actions against the Rohingya, which are basically ethnic cleansing, pushing them out into Bangladesh, raiding villages. So there's been open genocide in the country, and she's stood up. She's a Nobel laureate. There was a movement among some activists to strip her of her title of Nobel laureate. So you're right. There's being a human rights crusader, and then there's towing the line within your own government. So,
well, one of the things that the Chinese are trying to do is basically extinguish Uyghur culture. I mean, first off, the idea that there can be Muslims practicing their religion is antithetical to the control of the Communist Party. And I think they're part of this effort on the part of the Chinese for Uyghur women to marry a Han Chinese man so that they can eventually dilute the Uyghur culture and ethnicity. So this is, blatant racism basically is what this is all about.
Well, and there have been involuntary sterilizations of Uyghur women.
Yes, exactly.
So the question is, what do you do? The U.S. government is, going toe to toe with China over so many issues, and this is one of many issues. It certainly is at the top of the list in importance, along with security and other issues. There's talk of boycotting the 2022 Winter Olympic Games in China. Trade sanctions. What's the view from the State Department, Ambassador?
You lay down a marker, you tell them this is unacceptable and it's going to impact adversely our relationship. It doesn't mean we stop talking to them, but you have a whole panoply of kinds of things. As you mentioned, you can boycott this or put a tariff on that. I think in the bully pulpits of the world, we need to start engaging again. I understand that China and Russia last week were elected to the UN Human Rights Council. Well, both of these countries have horrible records. But the way the UN is currently structured and the way the US is no longer leading in the UN like we did in the past, these kinds of things will happen. And China will push its development model, which is we provide you security, safety, and economic growth, and we provide a country you can be proud of. So just shut up and toe the line. Well, that's certainly not the idea of liberty as we understand it, and the right of an individual to pursue his or her own path to the life they want to have.
Not a good year for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
It is not.
No, it's not.
All right.
We need
anything more
Eleanor
on
Roosevelt to come back and help us out on some of these things.
I think the footnote, moving on from China and the Uyghurs, is that there's a marked increase in the suppression, excuse me, of human rights around the world as COVID-19 provides a lot of autocratic regimes or autocratic wannabes the cover of suppressing human rights. So, we've seen even in places like India, where the Prime Minister Narendra Modi is evoking aggressive Hindu nationalism, and the Muslim minority there, if you can call 300 million people a minority, are basically second-class citizens. Likewise, in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte is violating every canon of human dignity and murder campaigns against criminal suspects, whether they are or aren't. Brazil, Thailand, Hungary, other countries around the world are taking advantage of the cover of COVID to put down demonstrations. There was, even in Israel, there was an effort to put down a demonstration using COVID as the reason to prevent people from protesting Prime Minister Netanyahu and his being charged for various crimes there. So, gentlemen, any comments before we move on about the state of the world?
Strong men love fear. Whenever there's fear and insecurity, somebody can come around and say, I will take care of that. I will make it good for you. And there are people, unfortunately, out there who listen, including in the United States.
Well, and the one thing, good point. And the one thing I would add, Pat, is we've talked many times on this program about the lack of U.S. leadership, in my opinion, at least under the Trump administration. Global leadership has resulted in some chaotic conditions throughout the world. And I think maybe this is especially true in this area where President Trump from time to time not only says, I'll do business with dictators, but he actually compliments them on the kind of people they are and the policies they follow. And I can't imagine anything that's more encouraging of greater suppression than that kind of attitude coming from the U.S.
Yeah.
Right. The Economist had an interesting chart in their article about the Uyghurs and human rights around the world. The United States among those countries around the world that is a weaker democracy since the pandemic started back in the springtime. So that's about all you can say about that. So let's move on to our third topic. We've got just a few minutes to briefly talk about the presidential debates, and we have here in Nashville, Tennessee, coming up. Let's switch gears here. The presidential debate at Belmont University tomorrow night. It's would have been the third debate in the series, but they skipped last week due to the illness of President Trump from COVID-19. He didn't want to do a remote debate, so that one was scrapped. And we're left with the event on the 22nd, tomorrow night at Belmont University. And these are the topics there. The Trump administration, the Trump campaign said that the third debate should have been on foreign policy. The debate commission, the head of the debate commission, said that there was really no precedent for that. So these are the topics that will be discussed: COVID-19, American families, race in America, climate change, national security, and leadership. Dick, what do you think about not having an evening devoted strictly to foreign policy, but including a number of other topics into the debate tomorrow night.
Well, the topics that you have up there, some of them can lead into that discussion on foreign policy topics. I think the fact that there's not something really focused hard on that is reality of where the US is in the world at the moment. We do not have a glaring, gee, we got fire, ring the alarms, we need to take something, care of something in the world. So we're kind of tidying up the overextension that we had in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places in the world. But the American public is more interested in, I think, jobs, future, COVID-19, schools. So we're focused fairly inwardly at the moment. And I think that'll be reflected in the discussion, although I will posit that President Trump will have a list of success stories on his foreign policy, and he will tout them out, like, moving our embassy to Jerusalem, getting the Gulf states to recognize Israel. It looks like we're on the cusp of signing an extension agreement with the Russians on the New START treaty, things of that sort. So he'll have a punch list. Oh, and don't forget, he renegotiated NAFTA. Some of these things are kind of, wait a minute, what is this really a success story? Anyway, that's my take on it, Pat.
Breck, any thoughts on the debate tomorrow night? What are you looking forward to hearing from one side or the other on international issues?
Well, I'd love to hear some discussion about their respective strategies towards both candidates, their respective strategies towards China, American relations with China going forward. It seems like that's one of the 2 or 3 biggest foreign policy issues that whoever the next presidential administration is, will be dealing with. So I'd definitely like to hear about that. Plus, Pat, I heard there's a rumor, maybe this is false, that as chairman of the Tennessee World Affairs Council, it'll be your finger on the mic mute button during the debate. I was wondering about that.
Well, I'm not chairman, but thank you for that. Yeah, we are having a debate party. We'll mention that here in just a second. But we will not be cutting the mic off anyone. I think it's illustrative to see the candidates in their interactions. I think people are calling the first debate a dumpster fire. Hopefully we won't have that tomorrow night. They are turning off the mic for the first 2 minutes of each of the 6 segments, in which each candidate provides 2 minutes to answer a question. So the moderator will be cutting the mic for that portion, but then the rest of the debate will be back and forth. We might as well talk about the debate watch. We're running long on time here, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that the World Affairs Council, in cooperation with the Tennessean and their project on Civility Tennessee, David Plazas, the editor of the opinion engagement section of the Tennessean and USA Today, he and I will be kicking off a debate watch party at 7:30 p.m. Central Time tomorrow evening. We've got a great collection of guest speakers. Panelists will talk about the mechanics of elections, campaigns. We've got some experienced people from senatorial and presidential campaigns, think tanks in Washington, and some local folks here. High school student is going to talk about the youth perspective on what's going on. So that should be a great lead up to the debate. So you can catch the pre-debate watch party at 7:30 p.m. And then we will have embedded in our Zoom meeting room the actual candidates debate. And we will be conducting debate bingo. And we're putting together bingo cards with all of the possible terms, from big lead to come on man, whatever you think might be the appropriate utterance of one of the other candidates. So that should be fun during the debate, and then we'll follow up with a half hour of post-debate conversation. We'll do some surveys of the audience. And just as a marker here, we have broken our attendance level for a Zoom room. We're over 120 attendees. It'll be an interesting management problem, but we will endeavor to let everybody get their voice in the chat room, or raising your hand, or
You have the mute button, Pat. You have the mute.
or in other way participating. So join us for pre-debate at 7:30, the debate, and debate bingo at 8 o'clock. We'll watch the debate and then have a conversation afterwards. We've got some messages here in the box. Let's see, we've got questions. Sana asked, hair from Uyghur female prisoners is making its way to our market. So that's not a question, but a comment. Austin Travis says that what's the likelihood of the ICC's initial investigation of China's actions against the Uyghurs moving forward to a full trial? And if that did happen, what would be the impact? Would the US support that even though we aren't an ICC member? Some general questions for the Gambia case against China and the ICJ as well. Dick, I don't know, and Austin, you probably know the answer. I suspect China is not a party to the ICC. We'd have to do a
I
quick
suspect
search of
the
that.
same. I don't know for sure, but I would suspect they are also not.
Yeah, Austin is correct that the United States is not a signatory to the ICC. In fact, the State Department has sanctioned some figures from the court over a case involving Israel, and there's been some pushback on that. So we'll have to take a look at that. But I think the answer would be that China would resist any interference from any body, the UN or a sovereign country, as far as interference in its internal affairs.
I agree.
Now whether the ICC has any legitimacy in China, we'll have to check that out. But I think that's the answer. Michelle Chan asks or comments, the U.S. And Saudi Arabia in 5-year wars against Yemen creates the biggest humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Million children will be starved to death. A big violation of human rights. Yes, I think human rights organizations are standing up against the campaign in Yemen between the Houthis, the Yemeni government, the Saudi military. The UAE was involved in a larger way, has pulled back some, but that's Yemen was in terrible trouble to begin with in terms of its economic development. There's a place where water resources are terribly taxed. The war has not contributed in any good way to resolving that problem. So yes, Michelle, you're correct that the humanitarian situation in Yemen begs for an intervention and a resolution of the battle there. Unfortunately, it's a symbol of the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia claims that Iran is involved in arming the Houthis. There's been ample evidence of that. Iran claims that Saudi Arabia has no business there. So it's probably going to involve a larger resolution of differences between Tehran and Riyadh over their competition before the Yemeni situation is resolved. Dick?
No, I was just going to say, I think it reflects the fact that we have been supporting the Saudis in this effort from the get-go in terms of supplying munitions and equipment and various kinds of things. And basically, it has not become a political issue in the United States, except for particular groups who might want to try to rally pro or con. But Congress hasn't done anything about this. It's not people talking about, gee, we got to take care of this kind of thing. So it reflects the isolationism, if you will, or the inward focus of the American public.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move along here. We got to get to Breck's question. But first, I want to mention that if you're not already aware of our Election 2020 series, please take a look at the archives that we have of these panels. We really can't portray in this slide the quantity and quality of speakers that came together for these programs. ambassadors, specialists from think tanks, scholars, military people across the board, some top tier individuals got involved in this Election 2020 series. And all of these are in the archives at the youtube.com/TNWAC. So check them out. We still have the election watch party, the debate watch party, and part 2 of America's Place in the World. That will be a week from tomorrow. Ambassador Tom Pickering and Ambassador John Kornblum, moderated by Professor Tom Schwartz. And then several weeks after the election, we'll have a special program called What's Next. So that's it. We're going to jump to our question. Gentlemen, any other comments before we work our way out?
No, thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll get on the question. Breck, over to you.
All right. The question was, again, which country is going to have youthful demonstrations wrapped around a significant anniversary on October the 25th? And the answer is D, Iraq.
Great. Okay, just one last note that we are very pleased to mark our 100th podcast and 60th webinar. So we look forward to bringing you more programs in the Global Tendency podcast series and in our video archive at youtube.com/TNWAC. And of course, you can go to our website and scroll down and see what's coming up on the calendar and sign up for our programs still to come. Gentlemen, thanks so much. Happy 100th.
Thank you.
It looks good on all of us.
Yeah, you surprised me with that picture you dug up there, Pat. So I'm going to have to find one of you in your submarine outfit there.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
Have a good week, gentlemen.
Thanks, good to see you all.
Everybody be safe. Thanks for coming.